Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jenna Ben-Yehuda, the Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm really delighted to be introducing today's launch of the Atlantic Council's new G7 China Economic Radar. This one-of-a-kind interactive visualization tool is the product of nearly 12 months of fruitful collaboration between our own Geoeconomic Center and MITER. Our teams have been working hard and working together to build capabilities in economic statecraft and prepare leaders for the difficult realities and financial trade-offs of this geoeconomic era. We began last year with Phase 1, profiling and mapping allies' economic statecraft systems. Coordination with allies is always stressed as a precondition for the sanctions, export controls, and other measures which make economic statecraft effective, and our allies agree. But what do we mean when we use that term? Well, so we chose to focus on three critical G7 allies: France, Canada, and Japan. With on-the-ground research in-country, including a very well-timed trip to Ottawa, led by Director of our Economic Statecraft Initiative, Kim Donovan, we've managed to provide comprehensive guides to the frameworks under which these countries operate. And you can now find them on the website of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center. Today marks the completion of Phase 2. We are really proud to be launching instruments that the Group of Seven, or G7 partners, could use to evaluate their exposure to China and to inform the cost-benefit analysis of sanctioning China in the event of a Taiwan crisis or another form of escalation. And I just want to speak for a moment about why we undertook this complicated and sensitive work. In the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the G7 sanctions response, the conversation started to develop here in Washington and in allied capitals around the world on what sanctioning China would look like in the event of a crisis. In some ways, it was a natural issue to consider, but there was very little depth surrounding these conversations. No one we spoke with could really answer the question of costs to the European, US, Japanese, and Chinese economies if sanctions were implemented. No one could really describe the coordination challenges between G7 countries on an issue like China and Taiwan. And there was no really clear consensus on even the kinds of economic tools that might be used in this situation. And we thought that was a pretty big problem because the stakes are so high and the risks are clearly enormous. Nothing should be done ad hoc without careful forethought and a full understanding of the implications. We often joke GeoEcon doesn't make plans for lunch without extensive research and coordination. So the prospect of considering sanctioning China in a moment like this was truly terrifying and overwhelming, and we thought we really have to get to work. So over the last 3 years, we've built a body of work in this field more broadly, really unlike any other institution. From our groundbreaking report in partnership with the Rhodium Group back in 2022, titled Sanctioning China and a Taiwan Crisis, that helped spur new coordination with G7 finance ministers, which created follow-on work examining the interdependencies in the G20 and China's own rapidly developing economic statecraft. So the road to get here was paved years ago. We've interviewed colleagues across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and in each meeting and each step of economic analysis, our team kept finding new and different layers of complexity. The bottom line is that this is a situation we all hope can be avoided. But given what we've learned in the last 3 years with Russia, it would be a mistake to not have done the hard work of thinking through the various scenarios and the risks. So this work reflects what we believe are the range of possible costs based on our research. We know that there's room to disagree both about our assumptions and our conclusions, but we hope that this work sharpens the thinking and adds data, granularity, and level-handed analysis to that debate. So before I yield the floor so we can introduce you to our economic radar, I really want to thank the MITER team for their support. Lisa Bembenek, Talia Gifford, Ted Zagransky, Nina Palmer, Ken Kuntz, and many more who've been part of making this work possible, including Chris Bassler. This event is being broadcast live, and after we show you the new tool, we'll move on to a panel of distinguished experts in the field, moderated by Senior Director of the GU Economics Center and our Chair for International Economics, Josh Lipsky. But first, let me turn to the architects of our G7 China Economic Radar, Deputy Director of the GU Economics Center, and C. Boyden Gray, Senior Fellow, Dr. Charles Lickfield, and Assistant Director Jesse Yin, to present our findings. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Jenna, for that kind introduction, and here it is, the G7 China Economic Radar. A lot of work has gone into this, so we're very proud to be presenting it to you today. We will show you some of the very exciting data viz tools in just a second, but first I was wondering if you, my colleague Jesse Yin, could tell us a little bit more, at least, about what sort of context we think this should be used in.
Of course. So like Jenna mentioned, we are looking at the event of a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. The sort of premise that we have done a lot of this research in is this idea of economic statecraft as deterrence. So we are looking at a scenario that is actually below the level of invasion. And I think this radar especially is sort of challenging our own assumption in our first report that there could be this sort of coordinated G7-wide action against China. China is a much larger economy than Russia. The G7 depends a lot more on China. So we wanted to really break down what these dependencies look like.
Thanks very much. So we will show you the first radar. I think you'll all agree it's at least aesthetically pleasing, and hopefully we can convince you that it's also convincing and useful. So first of all, you see 6 metrics. Some of them will be quite obvious to you. We wanted to look at the share of Chinese imports within a country's total imports, the share of exports too. This is trade, standard approach. But we thought we should go a little bit further. We also have data on investment. This is something that governments are looking into a little bit more and starting to find policies on. And then we went even further. We're looking at inputs, so imports from China that go into our own manufacturing, and also employment dependent on exports. Sounds a little convoluted, but we're very confident in this metric and the calculations that went into it. And this shows you the number of jobs that depend on our economic relationship with China. Now, a macroeconomist might say that we can't have all of these things at once, that there's a lot of overlap, and you wouldn't possibly be able to run a regression on these. This is true, but we thought that in this type of presentation, they complement each other nicely. We'll show you a few examples in a second. One other thing I should say is that this is data from 2019, not ideal perhaps, but we thought this was a good way of building a framework with data that wasn't distorted by the pandemic or by the war in Ukraine, and also that's still available, because unfortunately a lot of data has become less available since 2019, but ideally G7 leaders using this to make decisions would have more up-to-date data, and even perhaps several years so that they can look at evolutions. So as we've built this, Jesse, perhaps you could share some of the discoveries that you came across that surprised you.
Yeah, happy to. Let's start with the United States. So if we look at overall exposure to the Chinese economy for the US, we can see that there's still quite a high level dependence on imports from China at around 18–19%. This is second only to the EU as one of the US's trading partners. And then let's get a little bit more specific and take a look at electronics and computer manufacturing. As y'all can see, the exposure percentage goes up much higher, and so this is the share of Chinese imports as a percentage of total imports for the US in this sector. Both imports and inputs are at around over 40% in this sector. And this is interesting when we start thinking about how the US might want to reshore or friendshore this manufacturing supply chain. There's a lot more than just final assembly that goes into it. There are a lot of inputs that we're still depending on China for. So it's the difference of a final iPhone versus a graphics processing card.
So that's very interesting. That one criticism might be that the G7 is an alliance. They can help each other out. And if there are other countries that aren't as dependent on China, they might be able to help the US. So is it possible to look at G7 dependency in one individual sector?
Yes, there is. So we can switch it to the G7 here, and let's take a look at textiles and apparel. So I think we all know China as a manufacturing hub for clothing. What this is showing us here is that the G7 is still heavily dependent on China for imports, inputs in this sector. While this isn't a strategic sector and you're not going to win a war by sanctioning t-shirts, this is something that consumers are very aware of and that consumers can feel. So if there is increased tension and friction in the G7-China economic relationship, this is a sector that will be impacted. Also, interestingly, the outbound investment is quite low. So this could indicate that while retailers in the G7 are buying a lot of products from China still, they're not necessarily owning the factories in China.
Yeah, and we also see that the inbound investment, so Chinese investment into production capacity in the sector, is quite a bit higher. Quite often these are balanced and similar, but here there's a discrepancy, which I thought was quite interesting. So I suppose one sector that we have to discuss is mining and quarrying. There's a lot of talk about how dependent we are, and yet it looks much lower. So what do you think is happening?
So definitely here we're seeing some level of transshipment. So third countries kind of being responsible for final export into the G7. What we also found in our research is that a lot of critical minerals leaving China are already processed or included in other products or components, so they don't necessarily show up as raw exports from China, or raw imports into the G7.
And yet, I think, well, the outbound investment figure confirms your hypothesis, I think, because while we're not importing directly from China, we're investing. So clearly there's still quite a lot of activity in that sector going on, and our FDI stock is pretty substantial. So maybe one last way of using the tool would be looking at the aggregate for one country, maybe the most dependent country.
Yes. So the most dependent country would be Japan, if we can get there. Let's see. So this is overall exposure of the Japanese economy to China. Japan is interesting because with the geographical proximity, naturally the economic relationship is going to be more intertwined, but also the proximity means that if we are imagining Chinese encroachment in the Taiwanese Strait, this also becomes a security issue for Japan. So despite the high overall level of exposure to China, Japan could still be incentivized to join in G7 coordinated action. Japan also, of the G7, is the most dependent on Taiwan as well in their economic relationship.
Okay, thank you. So everyone's encouraged to use the device as much as they can, all the different permutations, and come back to us with your feedback. But hopefully those few findings have convinced you of its usefulness. Some of them are summarized here, and a few other extra, so have a look. But we didn't want to stop at percentages. Percentages were important because each G7 economy is of a different scale, so we had to have something to compare them to. But we thought numbers would be something that policymakers would also want to use. There's a lot of research on GDP loss, on trade impacts in sanctions. There isn't so much research on the impact on jobs, so that's what we decided to go with, especially since it's something policymakers can really grapple with and identify with. So this is our jobs at risk chart, complete there. So you can see all the G7 countries. We've managed to get the EU 27 in, but break out the 3 that are also in the G7. And you have some figures here, which, Jessie, you might be able to tell us the origin of. Where do they come from?
So it is the same metric and data that we have included in our radar exposure chart, just here in pure numbers. So the green bar represents the total number of jobs within each economy that is dependent on Chinese exports. And then the red bar is where we did a little bit more modeling and tried to estimate the number of jobs that would be immediately impacted or immediately at risk in a sanction scenario. And this weighting we built upon a lot of our earlier research about likely sanction scenarios, likely sectors that would be hit first. And so, for example, the financial sector is more heavily weighted, as well as electronics manufacturing and education.
Why education?
There are a lot of Chinese international students abroad, especially in the US, and in an escalatory conflict scenario, it is likely that these visas would be put into question.
Okay, so maybe we'll zoom in on the US. Well, it is cooperating, that's wonderful. Not quite yet. There we go. So what does this tell us about the US?
This tells us that the total number of jobs that are dependent on exports to China is at around 1.7 million. And then our estimation of the number of jobs that would be immediately put at risk is around 850,000.
Okay, so the US would take a substantial loss in jobs, at least in our modeling, if we were to decide to sanction China. But that's a smaller number than for Japan. And obviously, the US labor market is bigger than the Japanese one. So again, we have Japan very heavily affected at over 1 million jobs. And that's quite a lot compared to the full Japanese market. Yes. I can't remember the figure.
It's about 1.5%.
1.5% of all Japanese jobs.
Employment.
Well, so it will give leaders pause, I think, that obviously there are other considerations going on, as you mentioned earlier. So hopefully these two in combination, we at least hope that they would be useful to G7 leaders as they make these difficult decisions. Obviously, it was said at the beginning by Jenna that we don't want to be in this scenario, but I think we all agree we need to prepare. So obviously, hopefully these two tools help us think and help us prepare for this type of scenario. So that is everything. Obviously, everyone who is watching online is very welcome to go on the website and have a look. But there's an extra special treat for the people in the room who've braved the heat. What's that?
That is the fact that we also have one of these monitors set up in the lobby. So after the event, feel free to poke around and let us know what you think.
So hopefully you found all of that interesting and convincing. Thank you, Jesse, for all your hard work on this. And now we leave the floor to the panel. Thank you.
All right, hello everyone, and thank you, Charles, and thank you, Jesse, and thank you to Jenna, and again, thanks to our MITER colleagues for the collaboration over the past year on this important work, and I am very excited to be joined by this distinguished panel, and we have questions, and I know the audience has questions, and we'll get to as many as we can, but let me introduce our panel. To my left is Catherine O'Sabin, Strategic Economics Department Manager at MITER. Thank you, Catherine, for being here. To her left, Marshall Billingsley, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, former Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing, Treasury Department. And to his left, Beth Baltzon, Senior Fellow at the Geoeconomics Center and former Senior Advisor at USTR. Beth, Marshall, Catherine, thanks for being here. There's a lot to dive into in that presentation. Catherine, I'm going to start with you. Let's dig in a little to this concept of gray zone, because we use this at the Atlantic Council, and we have over several years as the kind of framework mechanism to understand when the tools of economic statecraft would be deployed. Now, from an economic perspective, maybe that works as a model, but in the real world, it's not so clear when you're in the gray zone and when you're not. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So the nature of gray zone activities is persistent moves and counter moves. And there's a lot of risk and need to detect risk when we are constantly in need to predict how there could be responses that would maybe escalate more than we intend. And so we consider it to be an escalation risk ladder, being able to determine in advance what the best moves are, what the best counter moves are, depends on the risk tolerance that we have. And we need to employ more technology, more data to be able to assess that risk. And a lot of that is the use of modeling and simulation. But the point is that we need to continuously be engaging. We can't have one-offs. We need to have a cohesive strategy in order to be effective.
I think that's right, and it's iterative, as you said, and continued conversations, not one-offs, is so important, especially in a space like this where the risks are so high of miscalculation. Marshall, I want to turn to you. You served in the first Trump administration. What kind of conversations in this space have you had, do you think are going on now when it comes to assessing economic risk of conflict with China?
2 points. The first is that the term was used, deterrence, in the presentation, and that's exactly the right way to think about this. It would be a mistake to take all of the good work that the Atlantic Council has been doing on this matter and to then fuel isolationism and fuel fatalism and fuel, in effect, the result of us being deterred. in the event that China does attack Taiwan, which looks increasingly likely, we will have to employ a wide range of measures, including financial and economic measures. The key is, what do we do to make employment of these tools less fratricidal, less self-defeating, and more effective in order to advance deterrence against the Chinese? We've not done a very good job of that. We're not doing the planning that is needed. One of the things, I was a member of the Strategic Posture Commission appointed by Congress to look at both nuclear and non-nuclear matters. And one of the recommendations we made is that our war planning process does not currently, but should include a financial and economic annex that talks about select employment of different measures, different tools at different moments in time across the continuum of hostilities to allow us to begin to make the sanctioning of extremely large Chinese banks, to go after certain economic sectors more reasonable and more achievable. During the first Trump administration, we had very conclusive information on a major Chinese bank doing things that we didn't like. And the resistance I encountered to any effort to go after that bank from within the Treasury, to say nothing of what State Department would have said, was enormous. But we cannot be in a situation where we view China as too big to sanction.
And do you think that's changed at all so far in this administration?
No.
I know it's early days.
I think there's still, and we're still waiting on the president's appointees for many of the key jobs. My hope is all of this excellent data that you've compiled and the analysis that goes around it will help tailor very discrete, specific measures that we should be taking now in the run-up to hostilities, as opposed to once the invasion has begun.
Thank you for saying that's exactly why we do this work. It's to highlight the vulnerabilities. And we never do this work to say you can or can't sanction China. I never want anyone to walk away and say, oh, it would be too costly, or of course this is how you should do it. It's just to understand in granularity and then to think about mitigation and actually prepare now, because it's not something that can be done in the moment. It takes years of preparation. Beth, I want to turn to you because we are living over the last 3 months what could be described as a stress test of a situation like this with the US and China in a trade war. And that trade war has exposed vulnerabilities on both sides, some of which have been highlighted before, but now we're living in real time. We see both sides at the negotiating table. And I wonder what you've learned, what you've seen so far that's interesting to you from the trade war that impacts this kind of work.
It's interesting because over the past 30 years or so, as we had a trade policy that was essentially organized around the principle that more interdependence is always better, one of the things that we did not sufficiently appreciate is the United States' role as the principal consumer in the global economy, and that other countries that had export-oriented growth targeted the US. It's one of the reasons that we've had challenges domestically with manufacturing and so forth. So it was always underappreciated the leverage the United States has through consumption. What I find most fascinating about the last 3 months is I think this administration, as it was in the first term, very aware of that power, but nevertheless overestimated it, in my view, believing that you could put tariffs on absolutely everyone with the magnitude we've seen with China, and that it would give us leverage. And instead what we've seen is that's not the case, that even with our consumption superpower, there are limits to how far we can push it. And I just will also say, China's reacting very differently this time than they did in the first term. I don't see wolf warrior, aggressive, fight back in that way. I think they know their points of leverage and they're deploying them more strategically.
I fully agree with that. I think we focus a lot, understandably, in the US about our weak points and what it would mean, Target, Walmart, back-to-school shopping. This gets a lot of coverage. But we don't really understand how this is hitting the Chinese economy so far, and we're only getting some anecdotal data. But it's obviously significant, given what they've been driven to do so far in negotiations. Catherine, I want to talk to you about G7 coordination. We're talking about this in a US-China context, but the whole premise of this work is that it would have to be coordinated if it could even be effective or deterrent, as Marshall said, it would only be plausible in a G7 kind of coordinated situation. How do you see the friction points in that relationship right now and the likelihood of being able to execute on something like that, given what's going on geopolitically in the world?
Yeah, I think we've learned that the US can't act unilaterally and be effective. We need to work with our allies. We need to have coordinated objectives and coordinated action. And a point I would make is that this can be a win-win for us and our allies. So China is the pressure point. That is what we key in on. However, we're seeing with rare earths, we're seeing in other areas where we are recognizing dependencies on China, and that's important. But more importantly, we're starting to work together. And that's when I talk about the win-win. We can make this something that, yes, we recognize our dependencies and we start to collaborate more. We talk about friendshoring and reshoring, that's all good, but recognizing this is an opportunity where we are winning with our allies.
Well, we have a G7 Leaders Summit this weekend, so a good topic of conversation. I'll come back to that in a second. But Marshall, I want to ask you about the markets. We do this economic modeling and we say this many jobs would be at risk and this would be the GDP hit. But what has come up so often in our private conversations around this is the market reaction could potentially dwarf anything you're thinking about from an economic sanction scenario.
That's absolutely true.
And I wonder, from a Treasury perspective, from your background, how do you think through that in a crisis situation and balance what could actually be happening in financial markets should we be in some kind of escalation in the Taiwan Strait?
You're absolutely right. Let me come back to that. But I think one of the key things for U.S. policymakers is we have to be in a position where we can do things unilaterally. And so the question would be, within your data and within all of the analysis to be conducted, what are those things that we have within our toolkit that we can employ on a national basis with or without allies? 100% agree that we should approach this with not just the G7, but with all of the EU and the Asian allies as well. And we ought to work to that end, because it's not at all clear to me that we're even close to that kind of consensus today in terms of their economic relationships with Communist China. The markets, the only thing surprising to me is how continually surprised we are at how the markets overreact to our sanctions actions. When you look, and I was sharply critical of the Biden administration's sanctions on Russia to the very final day of that administration. They did an excellent job, though, of mobilizing our allies. But really, the hit to the Russians in the early stages of those sanctions, when they didn't even put blocking sanctions on the largest Russian bank, the market reaction was crushing. Right? They had to shut down the Moscow Stock Exchange. Right? The number of things happened. The problem with market overreaction is that it then stabilizes and retrenches, unless you have, again, a dedicated campaign where you are signaling to the Chinese that we took this step and we are prepared to take the next step unless you back off, unless you back down. And we have to, again, be doing that kind of planning. I'd like to say we were at a high level of complexity. We're not. The Pentagon is the only organization that can truly do this kind of deeply integrated branches and sequels to planning that entities like MITER help with. But they're not conversant in the actual tools that the State Department, Commerce Department, Export Controls, and Treasury have. And so folding those three civilian agencies into, again, a DoD-run planning process, I think would be very, very helpful.
I agree with that. And one thing we've talked about a lot at the Atlantic Council is if the government could signal to the markets better of what would be coming on sanctions, obviously some of it privately, some of it has to be held back for all kinds of reasons, that might somewhat mitigate the shock reaction that we've seen.
This is what Biden should have done in the run-up to the invasion when it was crystal clear that Putin was going in, is more than signaling specific discrete actions to cause Putin to, in his own mind, call into question his theory of victory. We have to do that with Xi Jinping, because he has watched and he has reduced our response to Russia to a math problem. Last point. China today is doing the exact same things we saw Russia do in the run-up to the Russian invasion. They're buying lots and lots of gold. They're gradually reducing their exposure to our treasuries. So they are planning and executing a sanctions hardening process for their economy. And we need to be active in our own right to develop additional tools.
And on that point, I will just plug my colleague Kim Donovan and Maya Nicolate have written about this recently. You can find it on our website on this exact issue on
she's
gold and diversification. Yep. Catherine, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I agree completely, especially with the need for campaigns as well as the existing silos. And I think there's broad recognition that this is something that we need to get to. And I agree completely too, DoD has great planning. We, though, are not bringing together all the authorities of our government, and that is 100% needed. I think that there is a game theoretical approach that we are not taking currently, going back to the need for continuous moves and counter moves. There's a way that we can game out what that would look like. And that would give us the opportunity space to forecast what we think China's counter moves would be, and then be able to decide rapidly in a whole of government way what we should do next.
Yeah. Seems completely the right course of action and something we need. It's not even optional to approach this. Beth, I want to come back to the G7, which Catherine raised earlier. We have the leaders meeting this weekend in Canada. Should be an interesting weekend for all involved. What do you expect coming out of that? We heard there's not going to be a communique, not especially shocking. But when it comes to the G7 v. China, what do we expect to see from those leaders? They've done increasingly new work, building on Japan's G7 presidency on countering China. Do you think we're going to get some kind of cohesion coming out of Canada?
Having been in the administration and worked on G7-related items, the concern I have with the G7 and with a lot of our trading partners generally is an understanding at a high level that we've got to address dependencies, that friendshoring is good, nearshoring is good, but that there's something about the structure of the G7 that is very, very rooted in old thinking. I'm looking at the dependencies for Japan, for example, which really stand out, and thinking about things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was touted as something that would allow countries like Japan to diversify away from the PRC. We can update that data, but if you know how those supply chain rules work, you know that those pre-pandemic trade agreements aren't designed to do that. So my experience with the G7 is a lot of desire to move towards resilience, but a lack of ability to connect those desires and that high-level thinking to the nuts and bolts of the policies that will actually get you there.
So I want to get to audience questions. Please submit askac.org, and we'll get to in the room as well, but a few more from me for the panel, and I'll go reverse order now. Beth, again to you. Let's talk about tariffs and economic impacts, right? Because we model here sanctions and job loss. You and the Biden administration put the EV tariffs on, 100% EV tariffs. That doesn't directly affect a lot of US jobs. But I wonder in general in an administration, and Marshall, I'm going to come to you next on this, how you think about these measures and the domestic political impact of the measures. Because that's really why we did the jobs at risk work, not just the GDP work.
We were really thoughtful and we tried to target where we could. But we were also sensitive on the consumer side, but also on the domestic investment side. So with EVs, we do have the Inflation Reduction Act. You have chips. You want to use tariffs to protect those domestic investments. You want to use tariffs to protect where you think the jobs of the future are going to be. We understand that Chinese state capitalism has a fundamentally anti-competitive orientation towards the rest of the world, the tools that they're able to deploy to build up their sectors. If we want to compete in those sectors, then we also need to do investments, and you're going to need to be able to use tariffs to support those investments in order to prevent it all from washing offshore again.
So Marshall, let me come to you on the same question, and also framing it in the sense of how much domestic political pressure do you think the administration expected when they started the new round of tariffs after Liberation Day versus how much is experienced and how that affects the policymaking?
So I'm going to kind of dodge that question.
Totally fine.
But to tackle a piece of this, something that President Trump did, which was novel and had not been done in any prior administration, if you notice, was with regard to Venezuelan oil, threatening tariffs on countries that continued to buy Venezuelan oil. That's very interesting, and using the International Emergency Economic Powers
secondary
Act
tariff,
to do
basically.
that as a sort of a secondary tariff. And if you'll notice, for instance, the Lindsey Graham bill on Russia calls for 500% tariffs on any country that buys Russian crude oil. I think where we need to go with tariffs is to view them as a lighter version of a sanction and as something that, if properly employed, can be used for shaping operations. But to do that, the Treasury Department's probably not the right place with the right expertise. We need the U.S. Trade Representative, we need Commerce Department to advise on how to employ either the threat of or the actual use of selective sanctions, or selective tariffs, I should say, to begin to move the adversary in the direction we want to move them. The problem we face, though, is if we have already imposed overwhelming tariffs on the adversary, additional incremental threats may not actually have much of an effect.
It's just so interesting what you're saying, because when we step back and think about what's happened, tariffs are a form now of sanction. In some ways, it can be used that way. It's not how we would ever think about tariffs 5, 10 years ago, but it's evolved.
This is the first time that kind of thinking has emerged. I think it's good thinking, but it needs a level of precision to get it to the scalpel type capability that we do have with sanctions today.
Right. We're far away from that. Catherine, I want to ask you about second-order effects, third-order effects. You know, we can only model so much at the Atlantic Council, even with our fantastic team. So you do the first order. Sometimes we can work in a second order, China response. But beyond that, the permutations just go in 1,000 different directions. And that was what real life would look like on the ground, with reaction, counter-reaction, not just the G7 contained, but the whole world involved in one way, shape, or form. What's the best way, from a government perspective, to actually think through those problems in advance?
Yeah. It is a tough problem. I think we can start to define novel ways to get ahead of first, second, third order effects. Part of it is understanding, not just for us, but also our allies. You know, what are the second, third order effects for them? I don't know that we do that effectively as a government currently. We can also start to use more the automated forms of wargaming and modeling. So for example, what we've seen is we can have in-person wargaming to help us figure out what are the second, third order effects and what are the counter moves, what are the best counter moves. But then we can also run independent, autonomous wargames. We can do hundreds within days to a week, and then use those results as inputs to help us determine that option space.
I think that's the only way to do it, and just keep iterating and learn from that process and bring in as many allies as you can in that work.
And as we do that, we need to involve across the financial and economic sector in the United States, the private sector.
Yeah.
You know, during the early days of the sanctions on Russia, I had a hedge fund manager call me and say, you know, would I get in trouble if I shorted the ruble? And I said, well, the president has declared that he wants to reduce it to rubble in a tweet, so what you're talking about is consistent with stated policy, have at. But we need that kind, you know, there will be people in our private sector who see opportunity in some of the calamity that you're forecasting.
Of course.
And we need to involve those people to understand what they might do and whether what they might do is consistent with what we as a nation are seeking to achieve in the run-up to a crisis.
Can I just,
Please,
I would be remiss if I did not strongly agree with you that Treasury should not be in charge of tariff policy.
Okay.
Partly because Treasury is hardwired not to like tariffs. And in fact, some of the authority that Treasury had relating to tariffs was transferred away from Treasury because it didn't like to use them.
That's an important point. All right, I'm getting to online questions. Again, askac.org for anyone watching and listening in. Beth, one for you here. And the question is about data availability that you encountered in the Biden administration, something we encountered in our research. You had access to better data inside government. But I'm wondering how you found that, because this is a struggle if policymakers are going to make real-time decisions on the state of the Chinese economy.
It's a really important question. So when we got in, we were in the middle of the pandemic. That laid bare the dependency problem in a way that I think people hadn't fully appreciated before then. Then we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a different manifestation of that kind of dependency, especially for the EU on energy. And it's one of the reasons we said we should not be doing traditional free trade agreements. We should not be removing tariffs without having an understanding of how we're going to solve for these choke points. So that was important to us. I thought we would have a greater ability to get data about supply chains, the various nodes in the supply chains, the choke points in the supply chains. We did not have access to that, nor were the tools available to CBP or the International Trade Commission. They didn't have the tools to extract that information. The companies themselves don't know their full supply chain. So until we get a handle on that, I really appreciate that the team has put inputs there, because a lot of people during the pandemic were only focused on finished goods. The inputs are critical, because if you diversify away the finished good, which is basically what traditional free trade agreements do, and you don't diversify away from the inputs, you have not diversified.
And Marshall, what was your experience on data? Things have changed, obviously, in the past
changed
few years.
a great deal. You know, during the Obama years, I ran Deloitte's Federal Business Intelligence Services, and at that time, Chinese customs data was widely available.
Yeah.
They have since taken all of that offline. They have reclassified a number of many normal economic activities as state secrets, which then, of course, greatly complicate our ability to obtain that kind of information for this kind of analysis. One of the things that I hope your data can be useful for is for our, again, for our private sector, we all have many of us have mutual funds, right? Do we actually know within our mutual funds, if they're emerging markets focused, how much is dependent on China? You know, how Jesse mentioned iPhones. How big is Apple in my portfolio? Because China could kill Apple tomorrow if they so chose. We need to, the more transparency we give our private sector into their dependencies on China for all of the different matters that have been discussed, the better. We'll make better decisions for ourselves, for our families, and for the country.
Yeah, well said. Okay, let me turn to audience questions. Please raise your hand if there's something you want to ask. Yes, please, and introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. My name is Megan Check. I work for Shein. And I wanted to, am I correct in that the data here ends at 2019? I thought that you said that, correct?
That's right.
I was wondering if there are additional plans. Of course, you know, it's hard to control for the pandemic, et cetera, but we did see a lot of diversification after the 301s during the first Trump administration, and that's been evident on a lot of companies' earnings calls, even as recently as this quarter. Just very eager for additional data and curious what your plans are or how to interpret this in light of that.
So are we, is the good way to answer that question. And when we started the research a year ago, the only way to sort of standardize this across the G7 and all the sectors was to go pre-pandemic. But if we were starting again today, I think we could have enough post-pandemic data to do it. It'd be another, you know, major undertaking. But our ambition, and we talked about this a little, is this is just the beginning. This is a prototype, this is a framework, and you could use this framework with new data, and that's what we hope to do over time, to see the diversification and changes, which are certainly happening, but mapping them is critical. And sometimes, and this was an experience for us in the research, they didn't happen as much as we thought. And I think what'll be useful from 2019 to the new set of data to see what aligns with our sort of expectations and what doesn't. So that's our ambition with the project. Okay. Other questions, please? Any hands raised here? I'll go back online while everyone here thinks about what they want to ask. Go ahead, sir, please.
Yeah, I'm Mark Langevin at George Mason University Schar School. And the model is interesting. I think, you know, it gives a real tool for policymakers and students, researchers, and so forth. And obviously, it's based on escalation. But it also, the model obviously could be used for de-escalation and looking for advantages in targeted economic cooperation to create jobs here in the United States, amongst the G7, and beyond in the developing world where we have interesting trading relations, for example, with South America, you know, some of the African countries, Nagoa, so forth. How could we use this model to look beyond the immediate kind of tense relationships surrounding Taiwan and get a longer-term vision of what reintegration might look like in a targeted fashion in terms of things we want to cooperate on and things we want to decouple on?
Yeah, I'll turn to the panel for any thoughts based on the data on that. Beth, please.
I really appreciate that question. So right before we left in January, we put out a series of policy papers on supply chains, recognizing lessons learned from the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we got into some of the weedy areas. I will say on textiles and apparel, that's one of the areas that we covered. There's actually a defense strategic element to textiles and apparel that we should think about, Kevlar and some of the things, the fibers and so forth. Some of that is made right here in the United States, to your point. But the larger argument was we ought to be looking at sector-specific agreements, pick sectors where we think there's an opportunity, and then look for partners who would be able to work with us for the diversification, the nearshoring, the friendshoring, and take that approach as opposed to these comprehensive traditional free trade agreements that don't diversify and sometimes can't even make it past the finish line.
I think it's a great question. And while we may well be in a crisis over Taiwan within the next year and a half or so, it's not at all clear to me, given how China is behaving towards the Philippines, the South China Sea, and so on, that they're intent on stopping there. So we have a longer-term set of issues and questions we should be asking. We should be very focused on Chinese investment in infrastructure, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. Use of debt traps to gain control over ports, to gain control over critical minerals and assets. And if this kind of data helps us do a more tailored investment strategy and trade strategy with select countries, I think that would be a very beneficial outcome.
So there's a data layer that exists below all of these ideas and all the things that we should be striving for, including de-escalation and a longer-term vision. And a point that I would make, and I agree with all the data points that you made, Marshall, is that we don't do this well, even in our own government. And that's something that needs to change and must change. There are reasons why it's difficult to share data, and that makes it difficult to aggregate to the point that we can arrive at the right conclusions about China, about ourselves, about our allies. And then beyond that, being able to share with our allies, being able to aggregate trade data, that can help us not overcome completely, but get closer to solving the ambiguity around China's activities due to their very effective restrictions on data.
So I'm going to take an online question, and then I'll come back to the room, so prepare your questions. Marshall, I'll turn to you on this one. Would there be any sense, I'm kind of summarizing this question, which is quite long here online, but would there be any sense or rationale behind sanctioning China after an invasion of Taiwan, meaning that we talked about deterrence, that's normally how we think about this, signaling Xi Jinping otherwise, but if there was an invasion, market reactions as we talked about, would there be value at that point?
Yes, absolutely.
Please.
But it's not clear to me that you should hold all of your tools into reserve, or in reserve, until that disastrous decision is taken and invasion begins. We should be thinking about the things that we can do to cause Xi Jinping to step back and to ask the question, is this really worth it? Is what's going to happen to my iron grip on this country, which is not as iron as one might think, will the US and the Allied response imperil that? At the end of the day, again, this is a deterrence question. And what deters dictators is anything that threatens their personal safety and the apparatus that keeps them in power.
Questions from the room? Yes, sir.
Ward Wilson, Global Stability Network. My question, I guess mostly for Mr. Billingsley. Imagine you're in a room, there's a crisis, there's one person who says, let's threaten them with nukes. There's another person who says, I think we can do economic deterrence. What are the pros and cons? How does it work out?
If you're in that situation where you're already having discussions about nuclear weapons, it's too late. So the people who can employ non-lethal measures to try to advance the deterrence model should be involved from the get-go and should be involved. In fact, this is something that I've talked with the STRATCOM commander about, is you have all these targets you have to deal with. The number of targets are growing as China's nuclear breakout is accelerating. What if we were actually employing financial and economic measures to reduce your need to think about specific kinds of targets because they're no longer a threat in this kind of crisis scenario? So again, that takes me right back to the fact that we need a whole of government. We talk a good game about whole of government and we never do it. But we need a whole of government integrated planning process to think this thing through. China is too big. We will not treat them the way we can muscle an Iran, muscle a Venezuela, even muscle a Russia if we chose. So we have to come at this quite differently.
That's right.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? No, I'll leave it right there.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll turn to another online question here, building on some of the things we've been talking about, Beth. When we think about this situation with China, the question here is, what have we learned with the Russia experience? And what has China learned? Marshall touched on this a little bit, but the question is really, what has their economic statecraft toolkit developed to, and have we properly understood that inside the US government?
That is a really good and a really complicated question. We felt that we had understood the limits of the interdependence model. And something the IMF likes to do is focus on the cost to GDP of fragmentation. Somehow, less than 5 years out of the pandemic, we still aren't talking about the cost to GDP when interdependence goes wrong. So some of us have learned that, and a lot of our work on the inside was to try to figure out the right pathway to moving away from those dependencies that was rational, that took into account the effects on consumers and producers and reduce those dependencies. Once something has been offshored, it is really complicated to try to bring it back. We did try to work with a lot of our partners. Canada was really good on these issues. I think a lot of our trading partners were still wistfully hoping we could go to the status quo ante. Yeah. It didn't change enough. Some of that is changing a little bit more now.
I agree with that, and I think China, maybe in the first Trump term, thought a little bit about returning to status quo, but they've also learned the lessons over the past 5-6 years, and you see this with their economic statecraft, just how they're deploying it now on rare earths. And I don't think maybe we have enough sense, and Marshall, Catherine, tell me what you think, of what they're doing on the inside capacity-wise on statecraft.
Well, as I mentioned, the gold purchasing and the gradual non-renewal of bond purchases, we've seen them sort of exiting that. Those are indications and warning. Yeah. But there are other things that they're likely doing that I don't know that we necessarily see or are looking for. They're building up a fairly substantial capital reserve, forex reserve at their central bank, again, consistent with what we saw the Russians trying to do. They obviously, I would assume Xi Jinping took note of the fact that Putin blindsided his central bank governor, and she had a large percentage of her reserve sitting outside the country when he attacked. So my guess is that the chairman of the PBOC will probably be getting a heads up before they go after Taiwan, and these would be the kind of things that we would want to be looking for. Again, to just better allow us to understand what are they doing to move to a potential wartime, a sustained wartime economy.
Well, this brings up a good point, and Catherine, let me ask you about this, because I think what Putin banked on, as did Nabulina, the central bank governor, was if I could diversify into euros after 2014 and the invasion of Crimea, I'd be safer. And that actually backfired because of G7 unity. And I wonder how Xi Jinping interprets that signal, Marshall, to your point, to figure out, would there be G7 unity on sanctions? That's really the question, and could he fracture that unity?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. I think that we can see already where there are attempts to keep us away from our allies. And I think this comes back to, and I'm sorry to continue to use this word, but this comes back to the need to campaign strongly, both within our government as well as our allies, and we need to keep our allies close. I'll use one example where we see a very effective Chinese apparatus for messaging, for information operations. It's too late when we don't get ahead of that, but it's effective. It's very effective. And part of that is targeting populations to turn the population against what is in the best interests of their economies.
Okay, I just have 4 minutes left, so this is the final question. What I've identified in the conversation are 3 priorities to go take forward on this issue. One is better data, one is better coordination within USG, and one is better coordination with allies across the G7 and beyond. If you could only choose one to prioritize, if you had to pick one of those 3 as the top priority right now, because we know USG has to focus on one thing, what would it be? Beth, I'm going to start with you.
This is a very unfair question. I would have to agree with Marshall's assessment of challenges coordinating internally. If we cannot coordinate internally, it is a nightmare to coordinate externally.
Fair enough. Marshall?
100% right. Sanctions and tariffs are not a substitute for strategy, right? They are employed consistent with a broader strategy. We need to develop that strategy.
Catherine, final word?
And I agree. I would add to it that we also need to coordinate internally with the government, also with the private sector. And all that does come down to information sharing, which you mentioned, Marshall. And that needs to go both ways. And a lot of times in my conversations with folks in government, I come back to this question of whether we are seeking national security or secrecy. Some of that comes down to the need to declassify more information and be proactive with sharing with the private sector what our priorities are and the risks that we're seeing. Because a lot of times they do see opportunities that we don't, or they see them before we do. And we need them to know when to bring those to us and who to bring them to.
It's such a critical point. There's no effective statecraft strategy without the private sector fully integrated into that strategy. That's the world we live in now and the world we have to adapt to going forward. Beth, Marshall, Catherine, thank you. Thank you for being with us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you for those watching online. We want feedback on this work. This is a work in progress for us. We will continue to update it. We believe this is one of the most important national security and economic challenges facing the United States and its allies. We appreciate everyone's partnership, including the partnership of MITER in this project. We hope you continue to follow our work at the Atlantic Council Geoeconomic Center, and we wish everyone a pleasant rest of the day.